My name is Sierra Thompson, and I was 34 years old when my sister looked me in the eye and told me to find somewhere else to die, 3 days after our parents' funeral, while I was still using a cane from the car accident that nearly killed me 2 years earlier. And she stood in the doorway of the only home I had left, with moving boxes, her husband behind her, and a cruelty so cold it felt unreal, telling me I had 2 weeks to leave, claiming everything belonged to her, believing I had nothing, believing I was useless. And to understand how those words cut deeper than anything, you need to know that before the accident, I was a landscape architect with my own firm, designing gardens, restoring estates, and building a successful life until a drunk driver ran a red light and left me with metal rods in my spine, months in a wheelchair, years of recovery, lost income, and medical bills that swallowed everything, forcing me to move back into my childhood home, where my parents cared for me while Victoria barely called, barely asked how I was, and treated me like a burden. Even during Christmas, when I stood with my cane for hours cooking for her children, only to be excluded from the family photo because my wheelchair didn't fit the aesthetic, something I didn't know my father watched and never forgot. And when my parents died in a plane crash, Victoria handled the funeral like a performance, surrounding herself with people who barely knew them while I sat numb in grief. And 3 days later, she claimed the lawyer had confirmed everything belonged to her, refusing to show documents, triggering a realization that she was lying, especially when I found my father's handwritten note on Harold Whitmore's business card telling me to call him because he knew everything. And when Victoria returned with boxes demanding I leave, calling me useless and telling me to find somewhere else to die, in front of Maggie, our neighbor of 40 years, and Rose, the nurse who cared for my parents, they both witnessed everything. Maggie confronting her and Rose quietly writing something down. And later, Derek admitted privately they were in financial trouble, $400,000 in debt, and desperate for the estate, which explained Victoria's urgency. And when I finally called Harold Whitmore, he told me he had been waiting for my call, that my sister had never contacted him, that my parents had changed their will 6 months earlier after Christmas, and that there were things no one else knew, including a recorded message. And at the memorial reception, Victoria publicly implied I would be transitioning elsewhere, erasing me from the family narrative, until Maggie publicly defended me, exposing how I had cared for our parents while Victoria chased appearances. And 3 days later, in the lawyer's office, Victoria confidently claimed the will left everything to her until Harold revealed the real 32-page will filed with probate, leaving her stunned and accusing fraud, only to learn my parents had created a $14 million trust for her with limited annual withdrawals because of her reckless financial decisions, and that the family home and property were left entirely to me with a 10-year no-sale condition because I had been their comfort, companion, and caretaker. And then Harold played their video message, where my parents spoke directly, calling out Victoria's treatment of me, saying I was never useless, that I was their quiet strength, that they changed the will after Christmas because they refused to let me be erased. And watching that video broke something in Victoria, who walked out while I sat in tears, realizing my parents had seen everything. And in the hallway, she confronted me, crying about her debts and responsibilities and accusing me of not needing the money. And I calmly reminded her of what she said, set boundaries, and offered to loan her money on one condition: she must publicly apologize for her cruelty, leaving her unable to answer. And after signing the documents and receiving a private letter from my mother, I moved into their bedroom, continued physical therapy, began walking without a cane, and started rebuilding my life, while the neighborhood shifted its attitude and Victoria and Derek sold their house, lost status, transferred their children to public school, and struggled financially. And when Victoria called weeks later, asking if my offer still stood, but refusing to apologize, I refused to help, realizing accountability mattered more than revenge. And when I finally read my mother's diary, I discovered she saw me as her quiet strength and regretted not telling me more often, confirming I was never useless.
And 6 months later, I returned to work part-time, rebuilding the garden behind my parents' house, turning grief into growth, understanding that sometimes family betrayal reveals truth, that love can be quiet but powerful, and that the greatest victory isn't revenge, but reclaiming your worth, your home, and your voice.